Okay, thank you everyone. All right, thank you everyone for joining today for our webinar, Detections and Defensive Insights from the ContiLeaks. My name is Stephen Marshowitz, Director of Program Development here at TrustedSec, and today we'll be discussing a cache of chat logs from the ransomware group Conti that were anonymously leaked to the public. So pretty interesting stuff and very relevant. First, a few housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded, so you can go back and review it. We'll also send it out along with, we'll have some slides available, etc. So we'll make sure we get those to you at the end. Also, definitely ask questions along the way. We will either get to them if they're relevant for that particular topic, or we'll get them at the end depending on how it goes. So a little bit about TrustedSec. When looking across the full life cycle of your program, TrustedSec can help with building, with the risk, program, and compliance reviews, testing. There's not only penetration testing, of course, but cloud platform testing, customized testing as well, red teaming, etc. Fixing, remediation of those issues that we do find, which really has gotten a lot of run lately with so many different things happening and the complexity of technology. And then lastly, responding to incidents that your program has. And for today, we have a couple of those consultants with us. So it should be exciting from that perspective. Through our industry-leading attack intelligence research team, we've created several de facto standards and tools in security. This is really critical because the better the research, the better the information to understand the effectiveness of your defenses. When you align that information with the regulations and risks to the business, we seek to provide more value than anyone else to build your security posture in really the most cost-effective way. Okay, so always excited about topics concerning recent news, since it's so relevant and shows the various sides of the security landscape. And today, we will have three great speakers, as I mentioned. Erwin, Nick Gilberti, and Ashley Pearson. We're just on our threat hunting lessons webinar, so if you haven't checked that out, definitely do so. Glad to have you all here today. Stephen, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. My name is Stephen Erwin. I kind of set up this Conti webinar today. So with me is Nick Gilberti and Ashley Pearson. They'll be chiming in as we go forward. So you can see a little bit of our background there. So you can go ahead onto the next slide. So we're going to be talking about who is Conti and what are the ContiLeaks. So kind of before we dive into that, we'll take a quick step back and look at some of the ransomware quick facts. It's important to understand kind of the scope of ransomware and how it's kind of affecting our industry. These numbers are a little bit older. These are from 2020, but unfortunately, the trend for 2021 going forward, these have not decreased. These are only on the rise. The data breaches are very common with these ransomware as well. Those are what we call the double extortion tactics, where attackers are exfiltrating data and stealing it before they begin the encryption. This is something Conti was notorious for. And the ransoms are ranging from thousands to millions. Steadily we're seeing ransom ask figures in the 7 or 8, even 8-figure numbers. So unfortunately, those numbers are going up more and more. And, the recovery costs, that 1.85 million, that does not include any ransom payments. That's restoration costs as far as, kind of personnel, downtime, etc. What it takes to get back into kind of an operating function. So, Conti, isn't that just a family of ransomware? It is not. Conti is both a ransomware family and a threat group. So, going through here, you may hear the name referenced twice. Most of the time, we'll be talking about the threat group Conti and not so much the ransomware. They commonly call this ransomware as a service, where they will gain access, kind of get a foothold, and then potentially sell access to other ransomware groups, and taking a cut of that. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So who is Conti? A little background behind them. They are, like I said, considered a ransomware as a service, but they have also been known to deploy their own ransomware. They've hit over 400 companies internationally, including large companies, a couple that we know of, Shutterfly and Fatface, a clothing manufacturer. They've exfiltrated 100 to 200 gigs from each of those companies. But they've also have a pretty good track record about hitting critical infrastructure. They've hit several hospitals, control systems, kind of anything in their way they've been known to attack. Since these ContiLeaks have been released, there's been lots of ties of Conti to TrickBot, Raikou, etc., kind of a who's who of ransomware. These guys all kind of appear to interact with each other, a lot of interesting chat logs, some shared tooling, etc. So, a lot of what we're talking about, again, is very specific to the Conti threat group, but TrickBot is another very famous one, and they recently have suffered leaks similar to what Conti has just went through. So we won't be talking about that here, but that is out there and available, and kind of something else to consider. So what is the kind of hashtag ContiLeaks? So this all started during the start of the Ukraine and Russia conflict. The cybersecurity landscape became very heightened. Lots of worry from the defenders, attackers, as to what kind of Russia was going to do in the Ukraine. So no one was super clear on what was going to happen. Due to that, there was a couple pro-Russian cyber groups that came out. Conti was one of them, Lockbit, and several others all kind of came out and pledged that they were going to back Russia during the conflict, and if you attacked Russia, you would become a target of them. So kind of shortly after posting this "Hey, we're backing Russia" post, someone within the Conti group kind of had a change of thought. They decided that they were going to back Ukraine, and as part of that, kind of began the hashtag ContiLeaks, which was them essentially dumping tons and tons of internal documentation related to Conti. This includes playbooks, which we're going to kind of dive into today, talking about privilege escalation, how to exfil data, what to look for while exfilling data, things like that. Guides on how to operate their tooling, their actual tooling, including the software, and chat logs, from multiple different chats. And the chat logs are as you'd expect, some comedy in there, but very similar to what you'd kind of see in an enterprise Slack or something like that. A lot of back and forth about talking tooling, why things are not working, lots of jokes about working on stuff for a long period of time, and it either fizzling out or being detected. So with that, there is a lot of data that was leaked with this. Unfortunately, we don't have time to kind of dig into every single thing that was released. Lots of, again, playbooks and chat logs. So we've only kind of picked a subset of the data to dive into. Really picking out some of the interesting TTPs, things that organizations should be able to create detections and notifications around, not only to help in defense against Conti, but in defense potentially against any other ransomware threat actors. Conti, they're just like us. These are a couple snippets from the chat logs between kind of the Conti user base, talking about remember how if you can read someone's email, they can read yours, things like that. So we kind of included these just to kind of show there was some entertaining mail in there. It wasn't all business talk. Talking about kind of cows will be milked and we'll keep making money, things like that. So, money was kind of what drove these guys. Some of the translations are a little off. We've had to translate a lot of this from Russian to English, but you kind of get the gist of, what these guys talked about, what their area of focus was, and kind of, their motives. And with that, you have a fighting chance against these guys. They're very playbook driven, but they do make a lot of mistakes. This is a screenshot from the TrickBot leaks, which again weren't Conti, but this is probably one of my favorite screenshots to come out from all of this. If you're unaware of what it is, it's a TrickBot operator talking to another operator asking how to close this parasite. And if you're unfamiliar with what he's referencing, if you read his reply, he's talking about the keyboard shortcuts for the Vim text editor. So, these guys are out there, encrypting hundreds and hundreds of companies, and some of them are, unsure how to even exit the Vim text editor. So, you guys, there is a fighting chance against these guys. Reading through their playbooks, they have lots of mentions of not running specific software because it will cause detections, not running specific flags or triggers because it knows to trip off certain AV and detection mechanisms. So, reading through, you can see that they've made quite a bit of mistakes along the way. Not everything they do is rock solid. So, kind of going through this, hopefully with some of the stuff that we talk about, it should definitely give you guys a fighting chance on defense and prevention going forward. So going into that, we're kind of go into the TTP breakdown, detection and prevention. Just a reminder, we'll have some Sysmon rules, some additional Windows logging that we recommend. Kind of with all those recommendations, we definitely recommend trying them in a test environment before you roll them out into production, just to make sure, it does not have any ill-advised effects on your network.
Okay, great. So thanks, Stephen. And yeah, that Vim screenshot, I think, is just hilarious. But before we dive into the technical portion, I want to say that the thing that you should take away from this, if nothing else, is that this group, right, that has compromised all these organizations and done all this damage and everything else, the techniques that they're employing and the way they go about their operations is nothing novel. There's nothing mind-blowing about it. And I think on the defender side, organizations have a sense of like insecurity about what they don't know about the adversary, and what does the adversary know that we don't know. And I hope that through this presentation, we can kind of open the door a little bit and to kind of like to show you the inner workings of this and see that they're basically like any other group. It's just that they're oriented toward attack and damage. Okay, so they're just human beings, and you might be surprised by some of the shortcomings, I guess, that you might see. But anyway, we'll start off with internal reconnaissance. We're going to kind of follow the attack life cycle, not perfectly, but we're going to hit the points that are shown in the leaks. So with internal reconnaissance, they look for, here's a few vulnerabilities that they mentioned explicitly, probably not exhaustive list, but Eternal Blue, still a big one that they look for. The Net API vulnerability from 2008, SMB Ghost, and they look for RDP exploits as well. And so that screenshot is an excerpt from their chat. So as you would expect, after the initial foothold and reconnaissance is privilege escalation, part of that is credential theft. So we don't go into super detail with this, and the reason is that they don't go into super detail in their documentation either. But what they do provide, and the reference that I saw was this GitHub link. So this GitHub link is specifically mentioned in their documentation. If you go to this link, which we included in the references at the end, I took a screenshot of the GitHub page actually there. It's titled Active Directory Exploitation Cheat Sheet. And it's similar to, you can see there it references payload, all the things, that repo. There are a ton of techniques documented here. And so basically that's what the documentation that I saw comes down to, is take a look at this, try out these techniques, and see what works. So somebody mentioned, are we sharing the slide deck? And yes, we will be. But as far as these techniques go, it would be wise for defenders to go to this repo and take a look, because this right here, I think, is solid proof that this group relies heavily on open source knowledge, okay, and not just it's not a lot of, there's not a lot of secret sauce involved in their operations. So definitely go there, take a look at some of the techniques. There's a lot and it can be overwhelming, but at least become familiar with what they're looking at. The whole goal that they have in privilege escalation is to gain domain admin privileges. And the reason I say that is because subsequent steps in their documentation start off with, after we have gained domain admin, do XYZ. Okay, so that's their goal. And that's going to kind of be static between operations, because hopefully you get the impression of this, but they have sometimes an unskilled operator sitting behind the computer following these playbooks. Okay, so they're going to be repetitive and they're always going to be going after the same thing generally. And one thing I wanted to call out here, which we'll discuss in detail later, is that they have explicitly documented the process for dumping the Ntds database from volume shadow copies. And we'll show that later, but the reason I want to mention it is because that stands out as a technique explicitly referenced, rather than just a list of techniques that they're going to try from GitHub. All right, so we can go to the next slide. Okay, so part of their process is to identify, enumerate shares in the environment. And this is after they've gained privileges, okay? Or after they've gained appropriate privileges, typically domain admin. So they run, in this invoke share finder command from whatever C2 framework they're using, or post-exploitation framework. And at the top, there is a quote, which we pulled directly from their playbook documentation. So, it says, next, we study the extracted information, as in the information that they've taken from shares. And it tells you right there what they're interested in. We're interested in finance documents, accounting, IT, clients, projects, and so on. So they want to get a better sense of what the company does, what kind of information the company handles, maybe get a more accurate idea of the company's revenue, because that will impact ransom negotiations, and things like that. So that's the information they're looking for. Probably most of us already anticipated that, because that's what the sensitive information is. And then basically in the command there, that's pretty straightforward. They're just gonna look for shares and then pipe it out to a list. So a lot of this stuff is saved to text files in various folders, and they reference those text files or pass those text files to additional tools. Okay. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about command and control. That's pretty straightforward, but also data exfiltration. So another quote from their playbook. So we're kind of going in sequence here. After we have found the shares we are interested in, we upload the exe and config to the target machine with the necessary privileges and blah, blah, blah. Basically, they're talking about rclone. So rclone is central to their data exfiltration playbook. So they upload rclone with an rclone configuration file, which would be an interesting forensic artifact to recover if it hasn't been deleted. And then there's the command that they're going to run to do it. So they're going to copy out the target folders, and they're going to specify the folder or the destination that they're going to upload to, along with some other flags. So that's basically the bulk of their data exfiltration workflow. Is, like I said, it's heavily dependent on rclone. That's their primary tool for that. So going back to my statement at the beginning, there's nothing novel or secret about rclone. All right. And then as far as command and control, basically it's going to be Cobalt Strike with additional loaded tool sets, usually open source. And we can just hit the next slide. There we go. So let's talk a little bit about detection prevention for those two things. So as we talk through each of these detection and prevention slides, we're going to mention, we're going to reference Sysmon, or we're going to reference other controls, okay? Because we have an in-house Sysmon wizard, Carlos, and although he's not on the presentation, he will make a special appearance here in a minute. So basically what we have here is a snippet of a Sysmon monitoring rule, okay, that you would place in your config. And what this is going to look for is monitoring for the PowerShell engine launching or loading. All right, and I know you can't copy this down, so like I said, we're going to publish these slides, and hopefully you'll be able to kind of copy it out from there. Okay, so like I said, Sysmon is number one, and then at the bottom there we have some additional Windows native controls. Well, with the exception of maybe the blocking traffic, you'd want to do that at your firewall, at your perimeter, or other network security appliances. But basically, turn on PowerShell script block logging, which we're going to talk about in a subsequent slide in a minute. Look into application control. I think it's called Windows Defender application control, Microsoft Defender application control. That's basically your Windows native application whitelisting solution. Okay, so you definitely want to be using that, especially when we talk about things like rclone or static binaries. Obviously you don't want to go into application control and just put in like, oh, Conti's using rclone, I'm going to block rclone, then I'm safe. But the point is, the fact that they're using static tools and common techniques means that you should be able to abstract those and easily stop that action using application whitelisting, or take like a whitelist approach rather than a blacklist approach, or in other words, decide what you're going to allow rather than a whack-a-mole approach, deciding what you're going to restrict. And then block traffic to external sharing sites like Mega, Dropbox, other file sharing sites that are out there. Make exception or monitor your exceptions. We referenced Sysmon already. And then fundamentally, make sure you understand your baseline activity and alert on outliers. So none of this is going to happen in a day. You have to implement it, identify baselines, fine tune, and then move forward. All right, next. Okay, so that was specific to exfiltration. Now we'll talk about beaconing for a minute. Here we have another Sysmon rule for detecting beaconing, and then there's also some references to the Windows admin shares in there. So besides that, what are some other things you can do to detect and prevent beaconing? So the way that your network is structured, your network architecture is critical. So you need to have what you might call a defensible network architecture, where you create central choke points for outbound traffic. Perhaps you would prioritize DNS and web traffic first, because those are common. I mean, DNS resolutions generally have to happen for these attack kill chains, right? And then generally beaconing is done over web ports. Not always, but it's common enough that it's worth proxying. And so by setting up these centralized choke points, you can have tighter control and easier monitoring of that activity. Generally, I wrote there, restrict direct outbound communications. Basically, that's making the same point I just made, which is limit the ability for endpoints to directly contact the internet without an intermediary stop, basically, such as a DNS or a web proxy or centralized DNS. Okay, and then I mentioned two other solutions here. Rita is an open source analysis solution, basically, that has a lot of capabilities built in, but it's known for detecting beaconing. Okay, so that's something that's open source. You'd want to experiment with that a little bit before you put it into production, but it's definitely a good resource. JA3 is another good technology or solution that can be used to identify Cobalt Strike servers or C2 servers based on their TLS fingerprint. Okay, so we've observed this in cases that we've worked where we see commonalities between C2 infrastructure, where we have a list of C2 infrastructure, IP addresses, domains, whatever being used in a compromise that we're working. We take the fingerprints or the fingerprint of that infrastructure, run it through something like Census or similar, and we can identify other infrastructure that might be used by the same threat group on other campaigns. All right, so just for some consideration, those are worth looking into. Next. All right, let's talk about AD enumeration and basically credential theft. I've been given the monumental task of covering all 5 of these. That's mostly a joke, though. They're not too bad. So basically, you've got a combination here of native tools living off the land and external tools. Okay, so at the top we see the usage of net group, net local group, those types of commands for enumerating users, groups. So you see an example there: net group domain admins, net group enterprise admins, and net local group administrators. Those are all native to Windows, and they'll help with enumerating members of those groups. They're looking for, administrator accounts, IT administrator accounts, accounts with higher privileges. The second item there is a tool called Rubius, and in this example, you're seeing an example of credential theft. I think with the intent of curb roasting. Okay, so we'll talk about, I think we talk about curb roasting in a minute, but that's another technique that's not novel at all, heavily abused in organizations, attempting to, get the NTLM hashes of high privileged service accounts and either reuse those hashes or crack the passwords themselves. There are controls or there are detections and mitigations that you can put in place for curb roasting as well. AD find, NL test, and at the bottom there you just see a little like a batch one-liner they go through a host list which they've generated. They copy an executable file to that host, and then they use WMIC to execute it on that host. Like there it says starter.exe, it can be anything, but that's an example of executing, how they might execute tools on remote hosts. And then also at the end there you see ping, so that's going to go through that host list and ping each one to see which ones are alive and output it to a file, ping.txt. So that'd be an example of something we find through forensic analysis, is like ping.txt or like that host list at the beginning, things like that. Next. Okay, so Ashley, I know, was gonna jump in here to say a few things. Ashley, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, so kind of what Nick was talking about here, this is the AD enumeration process, but put into a playbook, like some of the other methods that we've seen employed. So as you can see, this is kind of like a documented step-by-step process for what exactly they're looking for, and then how to output it in a way that's easy for them to exfiltrate later. Specifically in regards to the users of interest, we can see again here, like Nick just mentioned, they're targeting administrators, engineer, IT personnel, anyone who may be working with the data that they're interested in. I saw someone ask about service accounts, and it would probably be the same thing for service accounts. If they see any service accounts that are within an OU or a group that may contain some of this information that they're interested in, those are also likely to be targets. And another way that they find maybe where some of these files are interested in or accounts of interest, down there at the bottom, we can see that they're using that Invoke user hunter. This commandlet allows them to find machines on the local domain where those users that they just enumerated are logged into, and help them find local administrative permissions that will help them do additional privilege escalation, some lateral movement. And like I said, it just really helps them narrow down which machines may contain the information that they're interested in. Next slide. So then here we get into that ntds.dit file dump that Nick was talking about earlier. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, that ntds file is actually a database that contains Active Directory data. It's basically like the keys to your Active Directory kingdom. It contains user objects, groups, group membership, and password hashes for all of those users and workstation objects in your domain. It's the heart of Active Directory. This is located on domain controllers, which makes it even more of a crown jewel within your environment. And in this instance here for this playbook, they're actually looking for volume shadow copies that contain this NTDS file. Since this is usually a very closely monitored file on your domain controllers, they take the effort to first check and see if there are volume shadow copies. And if they do not exist, they basically start that service on the domain controller and then force it to create one so that they can extract it without directly touching the ntds.dit. Now, given the value of that, like I said, a lot of EDRs, XDRs, AVs, or monitoring services will watch this file to make sure it's not tampered with. Because if it is, it's almost immediately going to generate an alert, and then it will basically blow up their operation at this point, right? So this is just another example of them attempting to live off the land, search for something. If it's not there, use an existing tool to then generate a snapshot that they can kind of extract whatever they need to from it. And then from here, it's more of the same stuff that Nick has talked about a couple of times. It's old command line tools, Wimic to copy the file. System and security hives are also copied in here using command line. And to just highlight the quote there to the right, that's basically the summary of why they do it the way that they do. They're not actually dumping anything. They're just taking and extracting NTDS sort of like in a secondary nature to not get burned by the fact that they're touching this directly. And then they pack it into a password protective archive to then extract at a later time. Nick, go ahead.
All right, so here's our friend Carlos. I told you he'd be making an appearance. So basically what we're going to talk about here, and I see some questions in the Q&A. What I'll do is let me mention this slide, and then I'll touch on a couple of these questions. I'll probably address most of them at the end, but monitor events 404 and 403 in case Sysmon or AMC is disabled. AMC is basically the built-in anti-malware service, or anti-malware, I don't remember what the SI stands for, maybe scanner interface. So, you know, if malicious PowerShell is executed, it'll get flagged by that, but it's trivial to bypass. So you want to make sure you're monitoring PowerShell script block. That's the point, is so that when PowerShell is run, you'll see what's being run. It'll be recorded to the event logs. And then centralizing those as well. Those are super helpful, especially in incident response and forensics. So also another item here is enabling process creation and via GPO. Make sure though that you also enable command line logging, because you're missing a lot of data if you only enable process creation auditing and you leave out command line logging. So real quick, before we move to the next slide, let me just answer a couple of these. It looks like Ashley's typing right now, but so Grayson asked, for orgs that don't really need PowerShell, is there any easy way to just disable all of those functions with group policy of some kind? So I'll just say this, even if you don't use PowerShell, straight up disabling it might have some negative effects in the environment that you don't really foresee. However, you can definitely restrict PowerShell substantially. There's a few ways to do that. And at the end of this slide deck, we have a reference list. Actually, we reference Black Hill's InfoSec webcast about, I think it's called Group Policies That Kill Chains, something like that. And I would highly recommend that because they go into a deep dive of all the group policies that you can implement to harden your environment. And I believe they touch on honey tokens as well. Somebody in here asked about honey tokens. So that would be a good one to look at. We just don't have the time during this webinar to go in depth there. And then let's see, I'll let Ashley answer the other one because she's typing already. So, okay, next slide.
I can take this one, Nick, give you a breather.
Okay.
So kind of, again, kind of moving through here, looking at, if Conti is unable to kind of brute force, or, they get a hold of account that they're trying to find an account with additional access. The screenshot on the left shows a great example of this. They'll try to brute force with kind of well-known passwords, the first set being super common ones that I know our pen testing team has seen a ton of, password 1, training, password 123, and then a small word list as well, which shouldn't be a shocker to anybody, kind of day, the month, year, or I'm sorry, month and year, month, year, exclamation point, things like that. And a lot of those will allow them to get that. So, they talk a lot about hunting for administrative permissions. They're hunting in their terms, looking through your OU, looking for administrators or people with IT access, because they will usually have access to additional tooling, whether that's backup systems, whether that's kind of third-party EDR systems that they could potentially use these same credentials to log into. And they, kind of, once they're looking for users as well, they're on a box, they'll check the browsers for plain text and saved logins. So, they mentioned that several times, kind of looking, once they're in and they have access to a user, they'll dump kind of their browser credentials, looking for any saved logins. Throughout the document as well, they talk about accessing password manager databases. They mention a couple of times that they found, password.1 files, for OneNote files, which would presumably contain a bunch of known passwords that would be stored in OneNote, and as well as KeyPass database files, something that they can take and attempt to brute force later to, again, grant them additional access. Kind of, they mention the traditional methods as well, in addition to doing the dumps that we previously talked about. They'll be using rainbow tables. They'll check password dump lists from previous breaches within companies. And again, they'll use kind of the golden standard, month or kind of whether, summer, July, August, company name, a year. All those are kind of ways for them to get inside of an environment. And if they're unable to guess a password, they have methods to crack them. So in the green is a snippet, is one of their tools that they use, which is used to dump the LSAS and allows them to kind of crack those passwords offline. Again, you can kind of see the bottom screenshot from their playbooks on kind of how to do it and what they're looking for. And again, they mentioned in there as well that they've found OneNote passwords.1 backup files. They'll try to access those, so they know kind of what they're looking for and where to find those as well. You can see them also talking about a Chrome tool to pull passwords out of Chrome and other browsers and and pretty much anything that they can get their hands on. They're going to try to pull passwords out and acquire those passwords. With that, this is another Sysmon rule. Again, this will be included within the slide deck for later, but this one is specifically looking for LSAS access. As you can see through the Sysmon, this would notify you when the LSAS or the CSRSS or any of those, kind of critical tools that you would normally see with credential dumping, when these get accessed, a Sysmon alert will kick off and prompt an investigation based off that. Yep, sorry, that this is the slide I was talking about. Yeah, this would be the Sysmon rule. Again, that is going to kind of show you LSAS access, CRSS access, etc. Nick, you put on here the protected users and credential guard. Did you want to dive into that one?
So not a deep dive, but I just wanted to reference it there so that people can basically go to the Microsoft documentation on it. This is something that you want to look into for preventing credential theft from, from memory, and blocking or mitigating the threat from using tools like Mimikatz and things like that to grab those credentials from memory. So domain protected users and credential guard, both Windows native controls that you can implement.
Okay, next slide. And again, Carlos pays us another visit here, kind of with his detection considerations. As the Sysmon rule says, you want to monitor for the LSAS access with kernel level objects as well as Sysmon. So, and you can kind of filter out noise by the image full path and the granted access mark for easy, to kind of find any outliers. And again, looking through, and if an alert is triggered with the 0x1FFFF is used, any process outside of those whitelisting. So, this is one of those, again, Nick kind of talked about, this isn't a kind of turn it on and we'll find everything, right away, all bad. This will kind of notify on some potentially good behavior that will just kind of need whitelisting and accepted within your environment. So unfortunately, this isn't a kind of turn on and catch the bad guys right away. This is going to kind of require a little bit of massaging and whitelisting to kind of fit your environment. But this is definitely something that will detect those LSAS access. So going forward, talking a little bit more about the lateral movement and what they like to do. They talked about this one quite a bit as well in their kind of playbooks. Is they were big fans of remapping the RDP ports. So what they would do is they would use the Windows firewall rule command line to create a new firewall rule. Within that firewall rule, they would create a new RDP port. An example on this one would be port 1350. And then what they would do is they would use the set item property PowerShell to change the RDP TCP port to match the newly created firewall port. And this is important because this is something that would normally bypass a service or port-based NDR or network detections or NetFlow. If you're specifically looking for RDP access within your environment on the traditional 3389 or whatever your organization may use, in Conti comes in and deploys something like this. This may not trigger as RDP access. This may just trigger as new communication between servers or workstations of servers, and this may slip through the cracks, and that's kind of what they're hoping for. And again, they're kind of using the built-in Windows tools against you, with the PowerShell commands to create registries and firewall rules. They're not doing anything that would kind of draw any red flags. And with that, they'll do RDP to commands. So they're not going to strictly live off the land, but they're going to do the best to blend in with the tools that they have. We see a couple references to AnyDesk, as you can see there, which is, they can use that for lateral movement, reconnaissance, exfiltration, continued access. They're running, using, commands to create these AnyDesks as startup utilities. Going forward, walking about that, they're creating these AnyDesks as essentially another way to use remote access. We've seen this a couple times on incidents that we've worked. They'll go in, they'll do some RDP, and when they think they can kind of get away using AnyDesk, they'll kind of install AnyDesk and use that for maintained access. And again, kind of what Nick and Ashley were talking about, the things that they're doing aren't groundbreaking. With the changing of RDP ports, using PowerShell, again, PowerShell script logging and command line logging that Nick talked about could detect something like that right away. And on the other side of that, making any changes to Windows Firewall. There's a link there to enable event logging for Windows Firewall. Once that's enabled, there will be two rules that will be, or two event IDs that will be created when a rule is modified and or created. So 4946 for a new rule created and 4947 for a rule modified. So, if you have the ability to turn on this logging and check for those two rules, this is something, again, that would detect these guys as they're either creating a new RDP rule or modifying an existing rule. These two detections would find that. And on the other side is checking for any registry changes. That's kind of easier said than done. Again, a lot of whitelisting kind of has to be taken into consideration when you're doing that. But checking for registry changes or new service restarts or installs that would catch something like the Ntds that they were talking about. And obviously kind of keeping track of approved software or anonymous software. That's, again, those are kind of big asks, especially with some smaller organizations. But being able to track services being installed or tracking on any unapproved software and making sure that gets removed, would definitely stop this kind of lateral movement, maintained access that they like to do. And, they talk about making sure they clean the environment before they go. They'll do some environmental cleanup. Again, this is kind of a chat history where they're talking about things that they've done. They'll be removing any credentials that they used in Chrome browsers, but to exfil data, to download any of their tooling. They'll remove their AD users dumps. You see remove Mimic. Mimic is a short name for Mimikatz. So they've ran Mimikatz. They're talking about making sure that gets removed. Removing any collected files with passwords. So again, they have a playbook for the types of things that they're making sure that they remove before they kind of kick off the ransomware, making it harder for the forensic investigators to figure out what was going on. So again, they're pretty playbook driven as far as what data they're kind of handling and what data that they're working with. And again, we don't know if that's just because they have so many, we'll say clients, or they've attacked so many corporations that they're bringing in medium to less skilled workers that they have to kind of write all this out and supply it to these newer people coming in to work with them. So everything seems heavily playbook driven. And to kind of round out a lot of those TTPs, with the prevention and detection summary, we have a couple recommendations here that kind of apply across the board, specifically for some of the attacks that they were using. System hardening, using some of the Windows native controls. We have a link in there as well that will walk you through kind of how to set up any of that hardening. Command line logging, this was a very common one. The Conti group really love to use shell commands and PowerShell to be able to work with an environment. So, if an organization is able to turn on, that verbose command line logging and save that, that is something that, can at least detect, or you would have the ability to maintain, kind of logs to go back and understand, if you're dealing with a post-breach incident, to be able to figure out what was going on within the environment. We always recommend using, Sysmon, especially with the enhanced rules. This kind of is if you're unfamiliar with Sysmon, it's the kind of Windows event logging on steroids, logs a bunch of additional information. And again, we included some additional rules, thanks to Carlos, that, will be in here and available in the slide deck afterwards. Monitoring egress traffic, again, kind of tackling that exfil, looking for different transfer protocols going outbound that are unexpected, such as FTP, secure FTP file transfer, connections out to Dropbox, OneDrive. They like to use Mega or Anon files were the two that were mentioned. And then finally, endpoint baselines, kind of understanding what's running on your endpoints and what's supposed to be running on your endpoints, and being able to identify when something new gets installed, whether that's malicious or kind of unexpected, whatever it is, to kind of be able to baseline an endpoint and know any differences going forward, and be able to look back and say, on this day we saw this new piece of software being installed. Again, it's something that can help you detect and react when or if somebody was within your environment. So kind of finishing out here with our insights, observations, and summaries. They're very, again, we've said this a ton of times, very playbook driven. As you can see right there, they're talking about messaging the group. They're looking for domain admins, enterprise admins, local admins, and then kind of additional info. Based off what we've seen, they have really good documentation, but it's very playbook and guide driven. They're writing out what exactly they're looking for within systems, type of users that they're looking for, how they want to gain access, which is great for the defenders. This kind of gives you an idea and a look inside what these ransomware threat actors are looking for, and kind of how they're going through their playbook and their tooling to get a foothold within an environment. In understanding what they're doing, and hopefully being able to implement some of these detections, and going forward will hopefully make it harder for anybody else to get in to your network, and if they do, hopefully create some roadblocks along the way. So go ahead and pass this off to Ashley.
Okay, so it's easy to look at these APTs and threat actors in sort of a weird light and view them as omniscient big brother type threats who are always lurking in the dark. But the reality is that these are just people who are employing playbooks. I think Stephen mentioned that earlier. And their operations at a very high level run very similar to their blue team counterparts. In fact, they employ a lot of the security program recommendations that we make to clients during tabletops, IRs, and threat hunts. They employ playbooks catered to common scenarios that they encounter. They have out-of-band communication methods set up. They have pretty detailed policy libraries, and they have playbook testing and updates. There's even a chain of command, an enforced team structure. They have roles and responsibilities pretty well outlined. And then there at the bottom, like, they have rules. There's a chain of command that's enforced. And just like any other team, there are points of consternation, primarily around communication, from what we saw throughout the ContiLeaks. Next slide. So just as we're studying and dissecting everything that came out with the ContiLeaks, we've seen that they're also researching us. They have educated themselves on insurance information, legal reporting requirements, customer and client information that may contain valuable information. They know what file names and content that may tip them off to employee PII or PHI, and locations that may contain proprietary information. And they aren't just aware that cyber insurance is a thing that exists. They specifically target files that your insurance providers have categorized as valuable so that they can prioritize their acquisition and exfiltration accordingly. So what is valuable to you is obviously going to be valuable to them. And they're also looking through everything for email addresses, names, contact information to assist with future or current extortion schemes, persistence mechanisms, and then potentially even to just sell on the back end for more money. We've talked about this a few times, but just to kind of drive the point home, this is not necessarily like a grim prospect. This is a very infamous group. And like I said, we have a tendency to be like, this is a huge threat, and, they are employing techniques and we'll never find them. But it's not necessarily to perpetuate this myth of these groups, but these are people who do make mistakes. They have habits, they become predictable. If they have a playbook that an unskilled operator is running, they're going to run exactly what's on that playbook, and they're going to repeat the same mistakes over and over, which will just make it easier to catch them in the long run. And to be honest, they're human, so they're even a little bit lazy. They're going to take the path of least resistance. They're not going to invest time, effort, and money into developing new 0 days when there are so many other viable paths that have already been made for them. They, like other groups, are going to leverage those known publicized vulnerabilities for lateral movement and privilege escalation. The Windows SMB vulnerability that was mentioned, that's from 2017. The zero logon one from February 2021, and Print Nightmare was mentioned a few times, and that's from July 2021, which is a lot more recent than the other two. And I know we mentioned another one too from 2008. Each of these vulnerabilities has hotfixes, patches, mitigation recommendations available. So why come up with something new when all of these may exist in an environment? If not at scale, then there's always, one or two, or, a bottom threshold of your workstations that don't get a patch applied correctly. And they're looking for those anomalies in your network to help facilitate their actions. And one last detection consideration with Carlos, but one of the biggest takeaways from the ContiLeaks was that there's a heavy reliance on shell commands. Most of it looked like it was hands on keyboard, human interaction with someone typing each individual command or copying and pasting something that someone else had put into chat onto console. And like we mentioned earlier, a lot of this can be captured if you enable Windows auditing with command line parameters. And perhaps the best way to defend not against just Conti, but threats in general, is to take the time and effort to practice good security basics and adhere to best practices. So doing things like system hardening, command line logging, enhancing your monitoring capabilities, looking for your ingress and egress traffic patterns, baselining endpoints to look for those anomalies will go a really long way to improve your security posture. This will also help decrease response time and improve visibility. Again, not just to find like the specific command line parameters that Conti is using, but if you are looking for user, parent, command line, that will help not just with incidents that you're responding to, but it'll also even help with troubleshooting. So there are multiple layers that some of this stuff can help you with. And just as a disclaimer, again, to harp on it, any of the Sysmon rules that we've provided or the logging recommendations, just make sure you test them before pushing them into production to avoid any potential issues with that. Next slide. And then here is some references and additional reading. The first two GitHub links on there especially were extremely useful when we were putting together the slides and content for this webinar. So thank you for the folks who maintain those repos. And then we've also listed a lot of the blogs that go into a bit more depth for the mitigation and detection techniques that we mentioned throughout this. So that kind of wraps up our piece here.
If we could just go back to that slide real quick, I just want to clarify a couple of these. So at the top, right, the top two links are a couple of the primary sources that we used of the translated chats. And the second link has some of their procedures, which we took the screenshots from. And then the other two are other references that will kind of give you some context as to what this whole thing is about. And then the second category there at the bottom. So adsecurity.org is a great reference for Active Directory attacks and how to detect and prevent them. The second link is what we referenced earlier. That's the cheat sheet that was referenced in their playbook for privilege escalation, trying to achieve domain admin. And then the third one, Black Hills InfoSec webcast, that's the one that goes in deep dive into group policies. So somebody mentioned about blocking PowerShell. I don't know for sure, but I think they reference it in there. And then a few of our blogs as well about process command line auditing and Sysmon community guide. And the last one, I included that because So the DFIR report has a multi-part series of posts about detecting and possibly blocking Cobalt Strike activity. The reason I included that one, which is part 2, is because it specifically talks about JA3 signatures, fingerprints, which I referenced in one of the slides. So I wanted to give that specifically, but if you go there, you'll also be able to see there are other parts to that series, and that's going to give you a lot of valuable information about blocking or detecting Cobalt Strike activity. But it's not just Cobalt Strike, it's a lot of basic attack techniques. So if you were to go through that and review some of that information, it would go a long way towards preventing or detecting malicious activity in general. So that's all I wanted to say about that.
We had a couple questions in the question and answer section here that I was going to answer live. So someone asked, trying to understand if this is something that can be detected from the host, the assumption being that they have compromised a host. A lot of the recommendations we have are ways to help you narrow down some of the techniques that they're employing on a host. The reality is the best way to detect this stuff is just to be monitoring a lot of this stuff. I think Nick mentioned earlier, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, but if you can forward your logs to a central repository so that you can look at all of your host information in sort of like that single pane of glass that folks talk about, that would be a great way to help quickly identify this. Your EDR or XDR, or if you have a SIEM or SOAR solution in place, that would also be a way to detect this from a host too. Some of the Sysmon rules that we shared will help flag on some of this as well. So if you're able to forward any of this to something that's going to alert you to it, that will help identify this behavior. And then as far as the anti-forensic methods, when we were going through here, I didn't see anything crazy sophisticated as far as anti-forensic methods go. Basically the ones that we mentioned in here, like protecting their files with passwords to prevent detection, starting that volume shadow copy service to grab indirectly a copy of the NTDS. Like those were some of the methods that we saw. And then just basic, like base64 encoding of stuff. I didn't see anything super sophisticated as far as that went. I'm not sure if Nick or Steven noticed anything outside of that.
I would just add that I'm going with the theme of the whole thing that we kind of laid out at the beginning, nothing super novel or interesting, but what I want to say is, you know, wiping event logs is trivial. You could do that in a one-line command. So although they weren't documented there, some of the common ones that are out there, like I just mentioned, wiping event logs, or maybe deleting browsing history, you know, things like that, just super simple ones. Maybe using like a secure delete. Those would be examples that would be trivial to implement.
Yeah, just kind of to piggyback that, looking through, kind of Nick hit it, the biggest anti-forensic methods that we talked about, you know, kind of cleaning up after themselves, you know, removing the rclone configuration so you can't see which anonymous file service provider they uploaded to, whether it was Mega or Anon Files, you know, just kind of cleaning up, you know, Mimikatz, things like that, anything that they moved on to the system, they did their best to kind of clean off, you know, to again just impede any investigations going forward.
Yeah, we actually saw that a few times in the leaks that we were going through. I think it's on one of the slides in here, so I'd have to go back and check later, but they have a playbook associated with their cleanup process that they are pretty strict about. So I saw a few times at the end of, you know, one of their missions or one of their days or whatever, they would go back and say like, you know, cleaned up this, removed this. So they do that fairly often. They go back and clean up their tracks to make sure that they don't inadvertently leave something behind.
So one last question come in here. So the question was, you know, a lot of these techniques would require local privilege escalation, you know, Mimikatz, etc. Any notes on how they're doing that? It's a mixed bag. We kind of talked about a little bit. They have a pretty good playbook set up for kind of password enumeration and guessing, as well as, you know, they've been known to dump LSAS and some of those other we talked about them, the scrolling through my notes here, the, you know, using AD enumeration to find interesting users, you know, kind of focusing on higher access users, you know, whether that's people in a domain admin group or a engineering role, an IT role, you know, something along those lines, and then using something, you know, the Ntds dumps, password guessing, Mimikatz. So those were kind of the big ones that I saw in there. Ashley or Nick, is there any other additional ways that you guys saw them kind of doing credential finding or anything like that to get that initial foothold? It was asked a couple times. Unfortunately, you know, there was no initial access documentation leaked. You know, presumably we can assume it was either through phishing or using of another access broker, but unfortunately none of that was included in this documentation. So with that, you know, we'd like to thank everybody for attending the webcast today. You know, thank you to everybody who attended. Thank you for Ashley and Nick for being on, you know, speaking with me. Hopefully you guys found this useful. Again, we will be making these slides available. So kind of check our social media for that. You should see some links on, you know, where you'll be able to download those going forward. You know, and again, feel free to, you know, contact Trusted Sec if you guys have any questions going forward. But with that, I think we'll end it. Thank you guys and have a good day.